Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist, and I'd like to welcome you to a 5-part series on supply chain data management. This series is sponsored by Ascent Compliance. Ascent Compliance provides cloud-based SaaS solutions that help companies manage their supply chain data, facilitate stakeholder and supply chain education on regulatory and program requirements, and increase transparency between businesses. Ascent helps companies overcome the challenge of meeting their compliance business requirement. Finally, Ascent streamlines the data exchange process for suppliers, making it easier for them to comply with their customers' data requests. For more information, check out their website, ascentcompliance.com. In this 5-part podcast series, I visit with several members of the Ascent Compliance team to introduce the topic of market access, consider what it is, an overview of trade compliance, how federal acquisition regulations, FARs, flowdowns affect supply chain compliance, the value of continuous monitoring, and the origins of laws impacting market access. The fascinating exploration of a topic that compliance practitioners need to be aware of. In this 5th and final episode, I visit with James Calder, and we take a look at chemical and product compliance and how lessons learned from there will help the supply chain professional in market access and trade compliance. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, back again for another episode in our 5-part exploration. Today, I have with me James Calder. He's the Vice President, Compliance and Regulatory Programs at Ascent Compliance. James, first of all, welcome and thank you for taking the time to visit with me today.
Well, thank you for having me on again, and as always, very appreciated to join you.
So, James, today I wanted to really take a deep dive into the weeds on a topic that I think has a lot of relevance for the supply chain practitioner, the compliance practitioner, the trade compliance practitioner, and a wide variety of others, and that is chemical and product compliance. So I was wondering if I could start off by asking you, what are the origins of laws relating to chemicals that go into products, and why does a supply chain compliance practitioner need to be aware of them?
No, that's a really good question. And understanding the origin of these laws also gives you a very strong baseline in making decisions on if the law themselves or guidance aren't clear. Understanding their origins and their intentions, you can actually make better decisions for your business. So there are a variety of laws which have created compliance requirements on the substances used in products. When I say in products, I'm mostly focusing on products which are not, substances or mixtures, things that are, durable goods, in essence. And most of the origin, if you want to look at some examples, would be protecting the environment and people and animals from harm of chemicals. Now, a lot of those laws, because of that, actually have come from waste laws. We use an example like the European Union's RoHS directive, which is focused on electronics. It's not about trying to reduce exposure of hazardous chemicals in the products during use. It's all about reducing exposure to those electronic products when they're being recycled or recovered during the waste process, because they found, hey, if you don't put these products in landfill, they want to recover them, take all the nice materials from there and recover the materials and electronics. They found the workers were exposed to hazardous substances. So the way to mitigate that exposure is to design them out of the products themselves. Then you have a law like the REACH regulation, which stands for registration, evaluation, authorization, and restriction of chemicals. It's probably the most complex and largest chemical law in the world. But what it does is it has its origin comes from, there are so many different laws out there. And they've amalgamated so many laws into this one law so that there is clarity and lack of complexity for businesses and for enforcement, NGOs, and so on. And it usually takes a path of identifying which substances are used in the market, and then when there's certain risks or unacceptable levels of hazards from those substances, they will do activities in the law to eliminate their use in products. And, we get down to, say, an example like California's Proposition 65. It actually kind of originated about chemicals getting into the water, or getting into other kind of aspects like that could cause a exposure to humans. But then it's really progressed to something now where it's looking at the exposure of substances used in products. So they always start kind of small, or maybe they start in very different places from where they are right now. But their intention is to either raise awareness or eliminate hazardous or toxic substances in products.
James, in an earlier podcast, I had the opportunity to visit with Travis Miller. And one of the things that Travis emphasized was that different trading blocks, different countries, different geographic areas are at different places in terms of not only their trade and international trade maturity, but also what is significant to them within that trade. So, for instance, you spoke about the EU ROHS directive. Though the environmental concerns of the EU, there may be different concerns in China. There may be different concerns in Central Africa. There may be different concerns in the region of Central Asia. And does that make the different concerns and different maturity levels of trade compliance? Seems to me it makes this area inherently more complex for the supply chain professional.
Yeah, absolutely. And that does actually touch on the origin a bit too, where, when these laws are eliminating the potential use of substances in products, so the manufacturing, for example, cannot use a toxic substance to produce product X. What does occur in a lot of those instances is that there might be manufacturers or production who move that production to other locations where you could still maybe use that substance in the production of products, and then import that product back into the market. And there's no exposure during manufacture, so it's kind of a way of getting around the promotion of safe substances. What a lot of those regional lawmakers have done now to say, okay, if you're not going to make the products in our market because there's laws about exposing the workers to certain hazardous substances, and you're going to move it offshore to somewhere else, then we're going to create the same regulations that would treat the importation of those products as if they were made in our respective geography. And that's where you get that large complexity of the supply chain being introduced to these types of laws. So they say, okay, you didn't produce the product here, but I want you to prove that none of those substances are in the products. And in some cases, none of those substances were used in the production of those products, regardless of where you produce that, even though it's not in our country. We want that proof at the point of import or aftermarket inspections. And that's where the geographies now are doing a little bit of changes, because maybe they used to ignore these types of safety laws or chemical safety laws, but they're finding for their manufacturers, they're introducing some of these laws in their respective geographies as a competitiveness reason. So if they don't create these laws to mandate the same level of protection for the workers, or same level of protection of the substances that might be in those products, then they're finding their local manufacturers are not able to export their products to the same level of markets that they used to be. So there is this follow-on effect that does impact the different geographies. When a law is introduced to protect its domestic concerns, they then ensure there's a competitive market for their domestic manufacturers by ensuring there's a level playing field and expectation on meeting certain requirements during the import of products, and not just the import or manufacture of products in the domestic market.
James, that really leads into the next, it starts with and then leads into the next topic I wanted to explore with you. You talked about and detailed compliance with some of these laws, but how does either the compliance practitioner utilize the compliance programs you've suggested to mitigate risk? Or conversely, if we want to take a look at from the other angle, what about enforcement? How do the enforcement agencies literally across the world come in and make an assessment and then levy a fine or penalty if appropriate?
Yeah, that's really important, because laws in themselves they highlight the goals or the expectations from the various actors that are impacted by those laws. So the only way those laws are effective is if there is active enforcement, and obviously budgets for enforcement, and if the companies are meeting the expectations of enforcement, then you've achieved the goals of those laws. So when it comes to enforcement, there's a couple of ways that we call them competent authorities or enforcement bodies, whatever terms you need to use, which will enforce chemicals in products. One is at customs, and you might have your customs agents or customs operators who will have a checklist requesting information on certain products before they clear customs, be they at an airport or a port. And what they'll expect is certain documentation. So depending on the laws, they might say, I want you to provide certain due diligence or certain documentation that shows you have due diligence in ensuring these chemicals aren't in the product. It might be asking about, what is your process? Do you have an established process in place that ensures these products or these substances aren't introduced in the product? In addition, they might actually even do spot testing where they'll use certain analytical techniques or analytical laboratory techniques where they maybe assess the risk of certain substances being in products. And then with that, they'll ask the actual importer, what documentation do they have to prove those substances aren't in the product or even the piece, material or subcomponent of that product. And, a lot of the customs people at the customs, they're going through the checklist. So if you're not able to provide that documentation, they actually may stop you from entering the market. So you have to have some kind of demonstration of due diligence. Otherwise, you're not checking their boxes. In addition, they might do aftermarket enforcement where they will target certain types of products, and it could be because of the belief that there's a risk of certain types of products, or there's potentially whistleblowers where competitors might say, hey, we're a domestic manufacturer and this X company is importing products that are non-compliant and they're doing it cheaper because they're not putting the right controls in place, and therefore it's putting us, a domestic manufacturer, at a disadvantage. Therefore, the enforcement bodies will go and knock on the door. And knocking on the door could be at the importers or even other manufacturers' locations. So the importer could be at their warehouse, their logistics operation. It could be the distribution centers. It could be a retail location. And they are able to take a product off the shelf or, open the door and say, hey, we're coming to inspect your facility. And they can go through a very similar checklist. Now, they don't kind of go always broad, but what they might do is look at, say, a harmonized tariff code. They'll look at that and say, we're going to target products that fall within that tariff code when entering the market. Or they might actually look at the business codes. Sometimes businesses have, the registration or registry codes, which identify what type of business they are, and then they'll go after that. And once they find non-compliance, they let everyone else know. So enforcement is happening all the time for these topics. They're just not always public. There isn't a first step of blame and shame. They will that's like the last case of enforcement. But there's tons of product removal, and if they find non-compliance, there's unacceptable due diligence to mitigate what they concern acceptable levels of compliance. They will ask you to remove the product. So that's very, very strong is the enforcement. So to prevent that, what companies are doing is you need to have the data. And if you have a complex product, say something like if you're looking at your computer right now, or even something like a car or an airplane, you can imagine the amount of documentation you would need to have centralized and managed in your systems to be able to prove that every part and material within those complex products do not have certain substances in the product. And that's where people are using, systems like Ascent to, either aggregate, collect all of that data and roll up, what is the status of this product with this respective, regulation that eliminates the use of certain substances in the product. In past experience, I've had that where enforcement bodies will just say, hey, looking at your product, I want you to provide some level of documentation that shows that this screw, this resistor, and this case do not have the substances under Article 33 in the REACH regulation and substances restricted under ROS directive, just like that. And I was able to take documentation out of my system, show them that I made the decision from strong supplier communication that they've done their own analysis or maybe test reports that the substances aren't in the product, and then they walk away. We're okay. In other cases, I've made interpretation of the laws and try to push back on the questions themselves. And that actually just caused a lot more questions on their side and caused a lot of disruption for me, because then they start asking more and more questions. And once you start peeling back the onion and you're trying to explain why you're doing something or why you're not doing something, they just start actually putting your products on hold. So that's why it's so important to have documentation that demonstrates the compliance of your products with respect to chemicals and products laws, readily available. It has to be documentation that has been reviewed for its quality and trustworthiness, because that is also one of the questions they ask. And if you have that and you have a consistent process in place that is meeting all that due diligence expectations, then you'll be presumed to comply with these laws. It's almost impossible for an enforcement body to do specific analytical tests to extract the presence of all these very crazy inorganic substances or organic substances that are in a product and as complex as the products I described earlier. So that's why you need to have that documentation. You need to prove to them you've done an adequate risk assessment and you've evaluated that your products do meet the requirements and you're a good actor.
James, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time, but this has just been a fascinating exploration. You have never heard me talk, but I always say the three most important things about any compliance program are document, document, document. So I could not have asked you for a better way to end this podcast series. Thank you again for taking the time to visit with me, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.
No problem, Tom. It's a pleasure.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I hope you've enjoyed this 5-part series on market access sponsored by Ascent Compliance. It's certainly been a great overview of access to markets for companies, how the supply chain professional relates to that, and what it means for your compliance program going forward. For more information on Ascent, check out their website, www.ascentcompliance.com. Finally, this has been a special presentation of the Compliance Podcast Network.